What's up, everybody? This is chapter 1 of Dialectic of Defeat by Russell Jacoby. There's already an audiobook of this online. It's Adriesta's Revolt, and I'm sure her recording or their recording is way better than mine. So yeah, you should look theirs up and not this one. So here we go. Chapter 1 is titled Conformist Marxism. I already have an article titled What is Conformist Marxism on this channel, and I don't know how much it overlaps with this. It might just be the same thing, but that recording is a little rough because I look up, at that time I was looking up a lot of footnotes stuff, so a lot of it's like detours and shit about like looking at book descriptions of other books and things like that. So this one will probably be a better listen, but I have a hard copy of this book in front of me now, so I can't really look things up like that. Yeah, so this one should probably sound smoother, and maybe it's different, maybe it's different content. I did like that article though. So section 1, quote, so much worse for the facts, end quote. With these words of Fichte, Lukács closed the first draft of What is Orthodox Marxism, the article, which I think is also on Adriesta's Revolt. To the skeptical, perhaps to the sympathetic, the words are outrageous. Marxism is not contradicted by facts. The facts are duplicit, or at best, mute. To quantify, classify, or categorize facts is to capitulate to them. Quote, truly orthodox dialectical Marxists paid little attention to the so-called, quote, facts, end quote, unquote. And I was going to wait to the end to start reading endnotes. However, since there's this quote without attribution, I have to go to the endnotes. That's Lukács in the article, What is Orthodox Marxism? And footnote. The obverse is plainer and more convincing. The facts confirm Marxism. Large events as well as the small prove the truth of the theory. The Russian and Chinese revolutions, imperialism, and the crises of capitalism all demonstrate the continuous validity of Marxism. Marxism is compelling precisely because it is accurate, and finally because it is successful. It works. The strength of the working class, as well as the victory of several revolutions, leaves little doubt. Success is the proof. Success. This is the rub. How does one evaluate success? The 17th Congress of the Soviet Communist Party in 1934 announced that the party had, quote, triumphed everywhere. Stalin declared that socialism was now, quote, the sole commanding force, end quote. Stalin. The official count dubbed this meeting the, quote, Congress of the Victors, end quote. Several decades later, in 1956, Khrushchev indicated how the victors fared, quote, of the 139 members and candidates of the party's Central Committee who were elected at the 17th Congress, 98 persons, i.e. 70%, were arrested and shot. The same fate met the majority of the delegates to the 17th Party Congress. Of the 1,966 delegates, 1,108 were arrested on charges of revolutionary crimes, i.e. decidedly more than a majority, end quote. Khrushchev. See the article by Bertram D. Wolfe, Khrushchev's Secret Report to the 20th Congress, Khrushchev and Stalin's Ghost, end footnote. In the book, Khrushchev and Stalin's Ghost, published in 1957, end quote. Or end footnote. The banal truth is that today's success is tomorrow's failure. Everybody wants a winner. Nobody likes a loser. The nothing succeeds like success is true not only for bourgeois society, but for its critique, Marxism. Marxists also want to win, or at least to side with the winners. Orthodox Marxism is chased after success, and this hunt has paralyzed its critical nerve, past and present. Before World War I, the German Social Democrats exercised hegemony by virtue of their strength and electoral victories. After their moral and political collapse in World War I, the Russian Revolution and the Bolsheviks assumed this role. With the discrediting of the Russian Revolution, the Chinese Revolution and Maoism stepped in. Because each worked, each promised to deliver the magic formula for success. The final argument flung by the Leninists at the non-Leninists was that Lenin succeeded. The non-Leninists were not only wrong, they failed. The lure of success and the sweet smell of victory fuel orthodox Marxism. Marxism-Leninism exudes the no-nonsense of how to succeed. This is the source of its perpetual attraction as a doctrine. Unlike anarchism, syndicalism, or council communism, it has proved itself, offering victorious revolutions for emulation. Everything pales before the fact of victory. The adherents of orthodox Marxism extol and promote the victorious revolutions and parties as the route to success, until their shortcomings or failures become too blatant, then another is adopted. The ex post facto element damns this Marxism to apologetics. Marxism degenerates into public relations for revolutionary movements. It turns critical only at last resort. It may suffice for philosophy to attain wisdom at dusk, but Marxism must commence its flight earlier. To condemn the failures after the verdict is too late. The issues are complex. Future events are beyond grasp. History provides no refunds, guarantees, or insurance policies. The misappraisal of the successful revolution, or the revolution in the making, the premature celebration, the mistake, or the retraction forms the marrow of the human experience in history. Therefore, the charge that a mistake has been made, or has been belatedly corrected, is itself compromise. It assumes a position outside of history, where there are no choices, failures, mistakes, or successes. The charge implies that it is not better to choose and retreat to the tired wisdom that history is bunk and vanity, or it hides behind academic knowledge too cautious to think and judge. If this is true, it is also insufficient. The rejoinder slips into the c'est la vie attitude, which excuses indifferently all theories and comments. It is no sin to be wrong, but it is no virtue to be wrong consistently. This is the question that orthodox Marxism provokes. History is assembled from a series of discrete mechanisms. If one breaks down, another is always available. This approach is immunized against criticism by a continual shifting of its object. Last year, Maoism. This year, the prison movement. Next year, the working class. A minor example is Charles Bettelheim, a respected French Marxist who resigned from the Franco-China Friendship Association in May 1977, marking his break with post-Maoist China. For many years, he enthusiastically praised the Cultural Revolution in Maoism. Now he believes that the campaign against the, quote, Gang of Four commenced a, quote, great leap backward. I mean, and well, that's the thing, right, is that it's actually Bettelheim being consistent, right? Isn't that like the Gang of Four were like the people who were like Mao's clique, right? Mao's clique of like people who initiated the Cultural Revolution, right? So it's actually, in that particular case, it's Charles Bettelheim being consistent and not just going with where the Chinese state was going. Not that it was correct to endorse the Cultural Revolution or praise it enthusiastically, but he is being consistent here. And he's, in fact, he's being consistent with a large thrust of Maoism, right? Maoism, if you listen to any of the things I have on here about Maoism, there's kind of like, that's what kind of when it disintegrated, right, as a movement, and to a large extent, is a couple of things. For one, first, the Progressive Labor Party, for instance, in the United States, backs away from Maoism after Mao makes rapprochements with the United States. I think just after, I forget the precise years of when they met and when the Vietnam War ended, but I think it was the early 70s, like 74. But the Progressive Labor Party, for instance, with the big Maoist parties in the United States, breaks with China in this period when it reproaches itself with the United States and declares the Soviet Union to be the biggest imperialist threat to the world. And then subsequently later, after the Gang of Four are tried, and the Deng Xiaoping comes to power, there's another break of Maoist with the state of China, right? And the last holdout is Albania, right? So, yeah, there's all this kind of crisis and confusion, but at least in this, just to say that like Bedelim is like kind of typical of most Maoists, I would say, in this period. And I think also Bedelim, I mean, I don't know what his approach to the China became, but definitely if you read like his final installment of the class struggles in the USSR, he's definitely moved to like something of a libertarian communist position, although probably a little bit more pro-peasant, which just makes it a little bit more anarchist and or something like that, or social revolutionary, if you're talking about Russia at least, than I don't know, than the more industrially focused left communists and council communists. Like it seems like he kind of like rips Leninism a new one in that book. Anyway, Charles Bedelim is an interesting figure, and I wish there was more secondary literature on him because I'd love to know. Because he lived a while after a lot of his like big books were made. I think he like his last big book was like from like maybe like the mid '80s, but I think he lived pretty decently into the '90s, or at least to the early '90s. So it'd be nice to have like a biography of him and his like political trajectory, because it seems like he kind of was someone who moved to a more maybe the libertarian aspects, or like the libertarian self-understanding of certain Maoists was, and their understanding of Maoism and China was extremely misguided. But people who actually took that faith, that belief in its libertarian character seriously, like I think that would apply to Bedelim, at least to some extent. We definitely had more of a like, definitely comes to some kind of anti-statist understanding of socialism as he works through the history of the Soviet Union, which is super interesting to see. That's probably why the fourth volume, or like the third volume of Class Struggles in the USSR by Bedelim is on LibComp, and not the other volumes when he did not have this critical position towards Leninism. But Christ, that was unnecessary for me to go through all that. But I just, the reference to Bedelim is interesting. Anyway, the ease with which the advances of Mao's Cultural Revolution are being undone suggests to Bedelim that the seeds for the reversal were planted earlier. Something must have been amiss with the Cultural Revolution itself that allowed it to be set aside so rapidly. Indeed, Bedelim tells us, quote, "When we look back and analyze what has happened since 1965 to 66, we can say that this change in the relation of forces was already apparent in the first months of 1967, end quote. He goes on to identify some features of this change: introduction of coercion, displacement of mass participation, rise of sectarianism, and so on. I mean, that's kind of my understanding, right? Isn't that just right? Isn't that by the point where like the Chinese state, still under Mao's leadership, like used the PLA to put down the the Cultural Revolution? I don't know. This may be fine and good, but why do we learn this only now? The answer is obvious. Although Bedelim says that the changes were, quote, already apparent in 1967, they were not apparent to Bedelim and many others for another 10 years. The reasons that he now adduces for the, quote, great leap backward were presented as successfully overcome in his book, Cultural Revolution and Industrial Organization in China, 1973. He wrote then that, quote, through discussions and struggles involving millions of workers and vast sections of the population, a new road was opened up in the struggle for socialism, ... It constitutes a decisive and permanent achievement, as decisive and permanent as any scientific or social experience which discovers new processes or new objective laws, end quote. Bedelim, in the book Cultural Revolution and Industrial Organization in China. Footnote. The book, quote, relies heavily on material I gathered during my stay in China in August and September 1971, end quote, Bedelim. Nor is this the first time that Bettelheim identified permanent scientific achievements that did not turn out to be permanent scientific or achievements. Bettelheim analyzed imperfectly the Russian Revolution and the transition from capitalism to socialism. In the mid-1960s, Bettelheim defended Stalin's ideas on the law of value in socialist society against, quote, Che Guevara. The rejoinder by, quote, Che decried Bettelheim's mechanical and undialectical approach. Several years later, Bettelheim debated the same issue with Paul Sweezy. I think that debate might be on this channel. Footnote. A brief summary of, quote, Che's criticism of Bettelheim can be found in Michael Louvie's book, The Marxism of Che Guevara from 1973. And footnote. See Bettelheim on the transition between capitalism and socialism with a report by Paul Sweezy, published in Monthly Review 1969. This text is included in Bettelheim and Sweezy's book on the transition to socialism of 1971. And footnote. Yeah, that article is definitely on this channel. And I think I have a review of it by Paul Maddock. And I can't remember. I think it's Paul Maddock Jr., which would have been in the Root and Branch days. Anyway, end footnote. In 1974, Bettelheim admitted that his writings in the period 1962 to 1967 on the transition from capitalism to socialism were, quote, not satisfactory, end quote. The problem was that until 1956, he had taken the Soviet Union as a, quote, model for revolution. The problem persisted for another 10 years, however. Only the, quote, lessons of the Chinese Cultural Revolution, quote, induced him to, quote, modify very seriously the terms of my analysis, end quote. Hence, Bettelheim began a major revaluation of the Russian Revolution in the book Class Struggles in the USSR. I guess that started in 1974. Two additional problems emerge here. Bettelheim's serious modification of the evaluation of Russia is not very serious. Bettelheim repeats the past quasi-official Chinese position on the Russian Revolution. And now that the Cultural Revolution has proved deficient, he may have to reevaluate it. Consequently, Bettelheim's reevaluation of the Russian Revolution may have to be reevaluated, and so on. Footnote. Footnote. For a fine analysis, see Ralph Miliband's article, Bettelheim and the Soviet Experience, published in New Left Review 1975, and Carmen J. Cirani's review in Socialist Review 1977. I think Carmen J. Cirani wrote a good book, or it seems like a cool book on workers' control and working class democracy in the early Russian Revolution and its dismantling. And I think he places that dismantling pretty early on in the revolution and not merely to the Soviet era, which obviously would ruffle. I think that's his position, at least. Could be making that up. End footnote. Footnote. For another Bettelheim debate where he demonstrates his mastery of Althusserian lingo, see his preface to the French edition by Charles Bettelheim in Guillaume Emmanuel's book Unequal Exchange. End footnote. Is this gloating? To stand utterly outside the fray is hardly virtuous. It purchases purity by cashing in critical intelligence and commitment. To enter into the fray inevitably yields mistakes, including major ones. Quote, there are no innocents in politics, end quote. Maurice Merleau-Ponty, and that quote's from the book Humanism and Terror. Yet neither is everyone equally guilty. Distinctions can and must be made. Political intellectuals who are perpetually on the hunt for successful revolutions betray their ethos. Success. The issue is not the failings of an individual, but a style and procedure that eviscerates Marxism. Success is peddled until it fails, and then it is peddled again in a new form. At any single instant, the success appears more than convincing. The facts are on its side, whereas the critics command only theories and harping objections. The Russian, Chinese, and Cuban revolutions silence critics by their very existence and success. Regis Debray's 1967 book, Revolution in the revolution, enthusiastically prescribed the Cuban model of revolution for all of South America. 10 years later, the situation was sobering. The success is non-existent. Gerard Chelon titles his recent analysis of Debray's theory, quote, guerrilla inflation, the Foucault theory as a theory of failure, end quote. Debray himself hardly disagrees with this judgment. He now calls his pamphlet a, quote, book of the moment, end quote. Footnote. See Gerard Chelon, Revolution in the Third World, published in 1978, and see Debray's self-critical comments in his book, A Critique of Arms, Volume 1. End footnote. Some of this can and has been characterized as, quote, third worldism, the pursuit and promotion of third world revolutions by North American and Western European intellectuals. Yet the style has worked as effectively and perniciously within the industrial nations. The black movement, urban guerrillas, the prison movement, women, youth, national minorities, and the working class itself have all been objects of instant mythologizing. Not the least of the ills of orthodox Marxism is the wake it leaves of demoralization and cynicism. Hopes perpetually raised and dashed take their toll. If its more public figures can switch objects without losing a beat, others have graver difficulties. Who can transfer their loyalties without doubt from the Soviet Union to China to North Korea to Albania, or from the working class to the student movement to the black movement to the third world back to the working class? The committed are leached out. The old anti-communist, quote, God that failed, becomes a weary, quote, gods that failed, end quote. For many Marxists, an old routine has been refurbished to account for perpetual mistakes, self-criticism. Louis Althusser developed this into a fine art and an effective marketing strategy. As an art, it neatly absolves past mistakes, makes way for new ones, and implies that the critics are spiteful and malicious for harping on the past. Who wants to criticize those who criticize themselves? As a commercial strategy, it is marketed by the engineers of the planned obsolescence of thought. Each theoretical innovation is fabricated from defective parts, designed for breakdown and replacement. The intellectual turns into a perpetual book buyer, compelled to buy the latest work to replace the preceding one. Althusser not only invented, quote, theoretical practice, end quote, but pioneered in its malpractice. First, Althusser argued that Marx definitely broke with Hegel. Several years later, he confessed, quote, I must admit that I have given a much too abrupt idea of this thesis, end quote. Althusser. Then Althusser admitted that in his notion of Marx's, quote, epistemological break, quote, I made two mistakes, end quote. It was neither epistemological nor a break. Althusser also erred in the book Reading Capital, calling philosophy, quote, a theory of theoretical practice, end quote. This mistake was not simply, quote, terminological ambiguity, but one of an error in the conception itself, end quote. Althusser. Later, Althusser discovered that, quote, philosophy is not a science, end quote, and has, quote, no object, end quote, no history, end quote. He also remembered in passing that he forgot about class struggle in the book For Marx and the book Reading Capital. Quote, this is certainly the biggest mistake I made, end quote. This list, if honest, is hardly enviable, nor is it exhaustive. Moreover, what Reich said of Freud, even where he was wrong, he was right, can be said in the inverse of Althusser. Even where he is right, he is wrong. Althusser represents a Marxism that is forever wrong, or right too late. To explain his multiple miscalculations, Althusser reaches for an alibi beyond reproach: history. The irony is missed. Althusser and his followers have dedicated themselves to slaying the dangerous dragon of historicism. Historicism threatens the autonomy, rigor, objectivity, and finally the success of Marxism. For Althusser, historicism corrupts with Hegelian effluence the science of Marxism. Footnote. Although defenders of the faith maintain that, quote, North American resistance to the work of Althusser is ... ideological, end quote, Terry Eagleton, response to a review of his book Marxism and Literary Criticism. Americans, along with the English and French, have written penetrating critiques. In the class by itself is E.P. Thompson's wild and extraordinary book, The Poverty of Theory. This reached me during the final stages of this manuscript, too late to fully consider or utilize. Brian Singer provides a fine discussion in his review of Rancière's Les Leçons d'Althusser in Telos 25, 1975. Other critics include Paul Piccone in the article Structuralist Marxism, published in Radical America, Richard P. Applebaum's book Born Again Functionalism, a reconsideration of Althusser structuralism, Raymond Aron d'un Saint Familier, d'un Saint Famille Latour, Pierre Villar's article Marxist History, a History in the Making Towards a Dialogue with Althusser, published in New Left Review, Norman Garris's article Althusser's Marxism, Alex Kalinikos' book Althusser's Marxism, and the review by Tom Good in Telos 30, 1976, and Miriam Glucksmann, Structuralist Analysis in Contemporary Social Thought, published in 1974. That's a book. And footnote. Footnote, see the chapter, Marxism is not a historicism, in Althusser and Balibar, reading capital. And that particular piece is on this channel. So if you look up Marxism is not a historicism and free association, you'll find that. And footnote. Yet Althusser justifies all his mistakes by claiming that they were committed at a particular time and place, as if there could be some doubt about this. In Althusser's jargon, the, quote, conjuncture, parenthesis, quote, the exact balance of forces at any given moment, end quote, is the universal excuse for errors. The fetish of indicating the exact time when they wrote, rewrote, and corrected their manuscripts characterizes all the Althusserians. This furnishes the gloss of precision while anticipating a revision of the theory when the, quote, conjuncture changes. Nikos Palantzis closes his book, Fascism and Dictatorship, melodramatically, quote, given the aim of this book, I prefer to give this conclusion a date, Paris, July 1970. End quote. Palantzis. Footnote. That quote for conjuncture is from the glossary of the book For Marx, published in English in 1970 in New York, with, quote, corrections and interpolations, end quote, by Althusser. End footnote. Footnote. See Nikos Palantzis' book Fascism and Dictatorship. For a good critical appraisal, see Onsen G. Robbenbach's article Palantzis and the Problem of Fascism, published in New German Critique. See also Martin Plant's article The Problem of Positivism in the Work of Nikos Palantzis, published in 1978. Salvador Ginner and Juan Salcedo, his article The Ideological Practice of Nikos Palantzis. Amy Bridges' article Nikos Palantzis and the Marxist Theory of the State. And Politics, and published in Politics and Society in 1974. And Simon Clark's article Marxism, Sociology, and Palantzis' Theory of the State, published in Capital and Class in 1977. I feel like that last article might be on this channel by Simon Clark. And I have Simon Clark's whole book on Althusser on this channel. And footnote. Quote, to understand these essays, end quote, Althusser tells us in the introduction to the book For Marx. The introduction to For Marx is on this channel. Quote, and to pass judgment on them, it is essential to realize that they were conceived, written, and published in a particular ideological and theoretical conjuncture. End quote. Althusser. Or Althusser suggests the, quote, exceptional situation, end quote, in which his essay on Lacan was written, explains why it has to, quote, either be corrected or expanded, end quote. Althusser. And that quote's from Althusser's book, Lenin and Philosophy. The evil is not in the appeal to history. Rather, history becomes the insurance policy for the perpetual theoretical malpractice suits. The theory of theorists is never wrong and never reconceived. The guilt resides in the historical process, the conjuncture. In this way, orthodox Marxism immunizes itself. It is always wrong or too late. The fault lies elsewhere. Althusser's response to one of his critics, John Lewis, I think John Lewis, he has a book, Reply to John Lewis. I think John Lewis was an intellectual in the British Communist Party, though I'm not sure. Althusser's response to one of his critics, John Lewis, indicates his achievement. Althusser chastises John Lewis for ignoring the historical situation in which the book, For Marx, was written, and then awards himself a badge for courage and perspicuity. Quote, Mr. Lewis never, talks about the political history, Quote, Mr. Lewis never talks about this political history. In the book For Marx, that is, in 1965, I was already writing about Stalin, end quote. John Althusser. Some 30 years after the Moscow trials, or 10 short years after Khrushchev denounced Stalin, Althusser was, quote, already criticizing Stalin. Althusser dreams he heads the theoretical parade while tidying up years after the procession has passed him by. And that's one of the things, if you read the book by Gregory Elliott on this channel, The Detour of Theory, about Althusser. Althusser seriously conceived himself as, which is like a fucking joke, as writing the first left-wing critique of Stalinism. So in the 1960s, everything else that had been written about Stalin was right-wing critique of Stalinism. It's fucking hilarious, and it's important to note that Althusser is not included in Marcel van der Linden's Western Marxism in the Soviet Union. Even though obviously Althusser is a philosopher and so forth, his comments were viewed, any comments he made about the USSR in the Stalin period or after were viewed as sufficiently superficial to not be included in that book. And Althusser, being such an intellectual of such renown, if he actually had something substantial to say about the Soviet Union in a critical fashion, he would have 100% been included in that book, but he did not. Anyway, if success needs re-scrutiny, so does failure. Neither success nor failure can be accepted as a blank fact. Success or its absence is only one fact in the evaluation of politics. We do not condemn the collaborators with Nazism because they picked the losing side, nor do we condemn the Spanish loyalists and Republicans because they lost. The history of the opposition to orthodox Marxism, council communism, quote, left communism, dissident currents, and so on, is without doubt a history of failure, yet it is nonetheless valuable. Failure proves nothing except who lost. This is often forgotten. No one likes losers. The history of revolution is usually presented as a string of victories, blemished by some setbacks and defeats. Rarely does one find honesty comparable to that of Marx. After the revolution of 1848, Marx wrote, quote, with the exception of a few short chapters, every important part of the analysis of the revolution from 1848 to 1849 carries the heading, Defeat of the Revolution, end quote. Marx. And that's it from Class Struggles in France, 1848 to 1850. Summarizing the intervening period some 15 years later, Marx wrote, quote, if then there had been no solidarity of action between the British and the continental working classes, there was at all events a solidarity of defeat, end quote. Marx, published in the inaugural address of the International Workingmen's Association of 1864, which is available in the First International and After, edited by David Fehrenbach. End footnote. Outside Marxism, the same issues of success and failure have surfaced, although not in the same form. In historical and sociological studies, controversy has flourished for years about the autonomy and resistance of various social formations. American blacks, working class, Jews, women, and so on. Evaluations differ on their degree of independence and resistance within the oppressive environments of slavery, concentration camps, and bourgeois society. Interpretations tend to fall into two types. One stresses autonomy and relative success at resistance. The other stresses the converse, the power and ability of the establishment to repress or incorporate an opposition. The issues are emotionally and finally politically charged. This is the point. A politics governs and fuels this debate. A left tends to elevate the advances and autonomy of the underlying class or group, and the right extols the power or genius of the establishment. To be sure, politics is often implicit. The politics is often implicit, but for this reason, it is so much the more potent. It is so much the more potent. It is never questioned, and thus congeals into a dogma. The left always and everywhere finds advances of the subaltern groups. And this is something that's I think one of the one of the big examples of this is fucking like some of the most egregious examples of this that I can think of is the Johnson Forrest tendency, both in its, to my memory at least, maybe I'm talking about ass, so this might be a bold statement, but you hear me out, especially in like Marxism and Freedom and other places, Dostoevsky and James, obviously I think they split in like 1955, 56, something like that. The Johnson Forrest tendency falls apart after its break with Trotskyism, and basically kind of like attributing this, that, and everything to some kind of indication of like revolutionary potential, right? Anything that kind of like moves within society, confronts certain power relations in particular places in time, or is not just totally kind of like submissive to authority, is some kind of indication of its inherently anti-capitalist revolutionary content, right? So there's definitely passages where like Dostoevsky just like attributes a lot of like anti-capitalist, like objective anti-capitalist content to like the Montgomery bus boycott and things of that sort, which is like, not that the Montgomery bus boycott isn't awesome or important, but it is completely confined completely imminent to capitalism. Just as like a strike may be great, but it is completely imminent to capitalism. Class struggle and like tensions and conflict are being inherent to capitalism. Doesn't mean that any whiff of conflict is some kind of like leading to the transcendence of an overall whole that is characterized by domination, such as the capitalist mode of production, right? But that's like I think that's the example that like pops to my mind. Anyway, where the hell am I? As a dogma, it might be better than most, and it does seem to rest on a self-evident proposition. Victims in history resist. They are also subjects of history. Yet it also draws upon the myth of success, an upbeat vision of the past and future conflicts. An examination of the strength of the establishment is dismissed as reactionary. Analysis of social relations that induced identification and not independence and resistance is precluded. This is so fucking apt. This like hurts how apt this is. Sorry, I'm just thinking of myself. The main thing I'm thinking of is like right now is this idea, especially right now, and like whatever you say about like the war aims of the United States or Israel in its war with the Islamic Republic, there's this idea that kind of like consistently floats around that like the people of Iran who want the overthrow of the regime, which I think is pretty large, like I think like it might be like somewhere between like 60 and 70%, would want the end of the Islamic Republic or something like that. I don't know. Maybe I'm talking about my ass. Maybe these figures are bad figures. Either way, there's this idea that it's fully within the people of Iran's grasp to overthrow this brutal fascist dictatorship, or it's like that doesn't mean like any degree, we should be cautious about, in my mind, about the the human consequences of war, right? That should be, whether the conflicts are worth it, whether the body count is worth it, which is something you have to consider. Like, there is a degree to which you have to consider in any kind of conflict. Like, yeah, there's going to be violence involved. I mean, that's kind of like, just like, if you believe in revolution, like, if you think that it's just going to, like, revolution is just going to be some kind of like peaceful thing where like bodies aren't involved, you're delusional. Either way, if, say, there's a civil war in Iran right now, there would be a lot of bodies. So when you're talking about, there's this idea that, like, for people who at least think that this regime is as awful and fucking brutal as it is, that the regime, that the people are just going to overthrow the government any day now without serious backing by some kind of external power, seems to me like utterly delusional, right? Like, if you actually think, like it makes my stomach churn, because fucking war disgusts me. It's a horrible thing, and a lot of people die who shouldn't die in wars. But this idea that, like, it's people power, just kind of like from this kind of like turning the notion of like from below into some kind of fetish, and granting some kind of truth to it, because it's, or something like some kind of like which is very dubious, right? It's always, actually, it's extremely dubious. Like, especially a lot of people who believe in revolution from below think that, like, the Bolshevik victory in the Civil War was a revolution from below, which it was not. Like, the preconditions for that, the disruption to both czarist society and the provisional government, like the disruptions within society that were due to the working class, self-activity of the working class and peasantry, that was obviously from below moment. But the Bolshevik seizure of power and the Bolshevik victory in the Civil War, they were not like they were like fundamentally based on like centralism and a top-down military machine in embryo, facilitated by Trotsky, who a lot of these people would say something like that. Some of the people I say come from the Trotskyist tradition, if they don't just outright support the Iranian regime, which a lot of them do, either at least tacitly. Like the idea that there's just this idea that the state actors are kind of insignificant to emancipation in some way, right? Or like something, or like the idea, right, of like, for instance, like, sorry, I'm trying to formulate words here. This is a difficult topic to talk about. But like certain things, like you'll hear things that like, yeah, the slaves freed themselves in the Civil War, which is kind of like a Du Boisian thesis. And not that there wasn't kind of like I can't speak on the character of that, but that just seems like, on the face of it, like very dubious, and like kind of wants to grant a lot of agency to people who to slaves, because it feels good to say that they had a lot of agency, right? But I just think of this, there's this constant thing of just like, kind of like, there's some kind of spontaneous, immediate power to the people, or something like that, that is like, gonna solve the problem, or something like, or it's gonna like emancipate themselves. And I think that probably for socialism, if you're talking about socialism, if you're talking about a self-managed society, it fundamentally would necessitate revolution from below. But if you're just trying to have like a, I don't know, something resembling like a bourgeois liberal democracy in a place, whether that be in the post, whatever the context of that be, like that, I don't think that's just like it seems very dubious to say, oh, the people are just gonna undo it, Sorry, I'm kind of ranting here, but just like this, just like celebration of just like the people, seems theoretically off base. Even if it's morally correct, and in fact necessary for socialism, when you're talking about, when you're talking, I don't know, I don't know. I feel complicated ways about it. I don't feel very simple. A lot of people, I think, seem very comfortable and very simple just with like the notion of like below. From below, you throw below onto it, and it kind of like neutralizes all of the fucking ambiguities that go along with things. It's like, so for instance, like some people, you'll see like Haymarket books, right? They'll talk about like solidarity with like Ukraine or something like that. Like solidarity with Ukraine, I think kind of, well, I don't know. I mean, wouldn't solidarity with Ukraine look like urging the U.S. to give them a lot of fucking weapons? And in fact, maybe even like boots on the ground? Wouldn't that be like what meaning like, and like not like would mean like for Ukrainian, if you are against Russian aggression against Ukraine, doesn't it mean like supporting the armed forces in Ukraine? And not some kind of like, and like being fully aware of like the messiness of that? I don't know. It's difficult to say. And if you're also, the thing with like, it's like the other thing to consider out is like I kind of mentioned this a second ago, like the violence of civil wars, right? That also has a body count and causes a lot of death. So something like, say, like, I don't know, versus like civil war versus regime change, right? If you're talking strictly about like death toll, which comes out better? I don't know. I'm getting carried away here, but just thinking about this kind of just like kind of like just naive in capacities of what like the people can do, or like not just what the people can do, but what the people will do, and like the degree of sacrifice people are willing to make to move society in a direction that is emancipatory, right? I don't know. Sorry. Deep breath. Let's keep moving. Sorry about that. As a dogma, it might be better than most, and it does seem to rest on a self-evident proposition. Victims in history resist. They're also subjects of history, yet it also draws upon the myth of success, an upbeat vision of past and future conflicts. An examination of the strength of the establishment is dismissed as reactionary. God, that's so fucking good. It's so fucking spot on. An examination of the strength of the establishment is dismissed as reactionary. Analysis of social relations that induced identification and not independence and resistance is precluded. It is the task of a left to always find victories and successes of the suppressed. Is it the task of a left to always find victories and successes of the suppressed? This degrades the critique of capitalism to cheering the home team, and it still serves its subject by minimizing the density and complexity of the oppressive social relations. That the oppressed were terrorized by terror conveys no insult. That they sold out to eat and live suggests no dishonor. The urge to people the desert of the desert of history is public relations for the moguls who have wasted it. The configuration of these debates testifies to the same pressures at work inside Marxism, the inclination to present the struggle as upward and successful. Certainly in the recent historical and sociological studies, the provocations have never been lacking. To argue that there was little resistance to slavery, as Stanley Elkins did, or to Nazi extermination, as Bruno Bettelheim and Hannah Arendt did, or to bourgeois power, as working-class studies did, was to insult, and the insult was compounded when it was further argued that there was not only little resistance, but complicity and cooperation. These works of Elkins, Bettelheim, and Arendt marked one swing of the pendulum. In more recent years, historical studies have moved in the opposite direction and have stressed the forms of resistance by slaves, Jews, the working classes, and women. And there's a series of footnotes here. Footnote, see Stanley M. Elkins, Slavery, published in 1976. Footnote, see Bruno Bettelheim's book, The Informed Heart, 1971, and Hannah Arendt's Eichmann in Jerusalem, 1965. It is hardly accidental that these books are themselves theoretically related. Elkins' book leans heavily on the essay that was later incorporated into the book, The Informed Heart. Bettelheim's article, Individualism and Mass Behavior in Extreme Situations. And footnote. Footnote. See the survey of the literature on the, quote, integration of the working class in John H. Goldthorpe, D. Lockwood, F. Betchhofer, and J. Platt in the book The Affluent Worker in the Class Structure. And footnote. Footnote. For an outsider, it is necessary to be intrepid, to wade into the vast and passionate debate on slavery. Elkins, Frank Tannenbaum have been attacked for years. This is partly due to the utilization or misutilization of Elkins by the Moynihan Report. See Lee Rainwater and William L. Yancey, The Moynihan Report and the Politics of Controversy, published in 1967. Inasmuch as blacks or the black family were seen as passive victims, the rejoinders emphasize the elements of resistance and autonomous culture. See the book, The Debate Over Slavery, Stanley Elkins and His Critics, edited by Anne J. Lane in 1971. Herbert G. Gutman's book, Black Family and Slavery and Freedom, 1750 to 1925, published in 1977. Takes as its point of departure the Moynihan Report and is an effective reply, arguing on behalf of a distinct black culture. On these grounds, Gutman criticizes Eugene D. Genovese's book, Roll, Jordan, Roll, The World the Slaves Made, published in 1975, for slighting slave culture. Whether Genovese represents or is made to represent an opposite position remains a question. George Rawwick and Evelyn Brooks Barnett provide two thoughtful and contrasting discussions of Gutman's book in the article, A Symposium on Herbert Gutman's book, The Black Family. See also George P. Rawwick's book, From Sundown to Sunup, published in 1973, for an important discussion of the issues. Especially, one final note here, Elkins is far from finished. His article, The Two Arguments on Slavery, published in 1975, included in the third edition of the book Slavery, is apposite. And footnote. Footnote. See Reuben Einstein's book, Jewish Resistance in Nazi-occupied Eastern Europe, published in 1974. See Jacob Robinson's book, And the Crooked Shall Be Made Straight, The Eichmann Trial, The Jewish Catastrophe, and Hannah Arendt's Narrative, published in 1965. And Terence Desprez, The Survivor, An Anatomy of Life in the Death Camps, published in 1970. End footnote. Footnote. The fundamental work which has inspired many, often lesser efforts is E.P. Thompson's book, The Making of the English Working Class. End footnote. Footnote. From a burgeoning literature, see Sheila Raubotham's book, Women, Resistance, and Revolution, published in 1972. End footnote. If more just, this perspective begins to shade into mythic visions of resistance and progress. At this point, it raises more questions than it answers. The image of success and victories vies with the actual defeats and setbacks. If, for instance, the working class were progressing in their culture, struggle, and class consciousness, their defeat or relative passivity would become not more but less understandable. If the structure and toll of domination are omitted, history is traded for cosmetics. Quote, a quote, history from above, end quote, of the intricate machinery of class domination is thus no less essential than a, quote, history from below, end quote. Indeed, without it, the latter in the end becomes one-sided, if the better side, end quote. Perry Anderson, in the book Lineages of the Absolutist State. And footnote. For those who imagine that dialectics consist of matching mathematical opposites, no problem exists. On the one hand, there is domination, on the other resistance. Marcuse's book One-Dimensional Man was regularly derided as undialectical. Marcuse forgot that society was two-dimensional. Domination always incites resistance. This is the official Marxist interpretation of everything, or the power of positive thinking for Marxists. Any suggestion of the victory of the state or bourgeois culture is countered by stressing the victory of the working classes and their culture. Each negative statement is answered by a positive. The total is zero. This mathematical interpretation of history issues into a picture of forces of liberation battling the forces of domination. If this is adequate for actual warfare, it fails as a model for the existence and persistence of capitalism. Capitalism does not simply rely on perpetual military subjugation. For this reason, any blank juxtaposition of, quote, history from above and, quote, history from below threatens to conclude in two-volume works with few transitions. The crucial question is the relationship between these two histories. The official proletarian culture of the Third International, and most recently China, portrayed only smiling, working, powerful peasants. Frowns, sickness, betrayals, and defeats were eschewed. Andrei Zhdanov, proponent of social realism, Frowns, sickness, betrayals, and defeats were eschewed. Andrei Zhdanov, proponent of socialist realism, explained why optimism and heroism were the guiding slogans. Quote, our Soviet literature is impregnated with enthusiasm and the spirit of heroic deeds. It is optimistic in essence because it is the literature of the rising class of the proletariat, end quote. Andrei Zhdanov. This is the open and hidden logic of orthodox Marxism in recent historical studies. The need to stress the victories of the oppressed is deep-seated and humanistic, but it maltreats its subject when the objective defeats and surrenders, political and psychological, are whitewashed and remain unrecognized and uncomprehended. Let there be no misunderstanding. The vision of unresisting victims by the social worker or the philanthropist is no better. This is a static view of history or the administrative dream of the world. The application of the, quote, dialectical scheme that decays into a behavioral psychology must also be avoided. Stimulus provokes a response, or repression yields rebellion. Both visions corrode into myths. New section, Section 2. Distancing oneself from the political plane reveals the theoretical outline of orthodox Marxism, which is marked by a commitment to science. An esteem for science is hardly unique to Marxism. It infuses modern society. Science guarantees success. Marxism inherited this proposition from bourgeois society and hammered it into a deadly weapon. For Marxists, it became the revolver for shooting dissidents and opponents. The primal and final charge that orthodox Marxism invokes is that its opponents have violated the canons of science. They are pre-scientific, non-scientific, literary, romantic, utopian, historicist, humanist, aesthetic. Marx labeled his own work scientific, contrasting it to utopian and other brands of socialism. Quote, there is no royal road to science, end quote, he cautioned his French readers of Capital. Yet Marx employed the term, quote, science sparingly, wary of excessive usage. More important for Marx, science meant Wissenschaft, a term that resounds with Hegelian tones. That the English and French, quote, science is more limited than German Wissenschaft is a point regularly made in cultural and intellectual studies. Because it involves the entire question of Hegel's impact on Marxism, however, it merits more attention than a footnote. If Marx deemed his own work scientific, he distrusted a religion of science. On more than one occasion, he dissociated himself from the term, quote, scientific socialism. Marx charged Proudhon with fetishizing science, quote, no school of thought has thrown around the word, quote, science more haphazardly than that of Proudhon, unquote, Marx. For Proudhon, science, quote, reduces itself to a slender proportion of scientific formulae. He is the man in search of formulas, unquote, Marx. Second, sorry. Sorry, there's footnotes that I missed. Yeah, that last quote was from Poverty of Philosophy. Years later, responding to Bakunin's accusation that, quote, scientific socialism, wissenschaftlicher Sozialismus, was elitist, Marx clarified, quote, scientific socialism was only used in opposition to utopian socialism, which wants to attach the people to new delusions, instead of limiting it to science, to the knowledge of the social movement made by the people itself, end quote. Marx, conspectus of Bakunin's book, Statism and Anarchy. The, quote, science here meant, quote, knowledge of the social movement made by the people itself, end quote. Erkenntnis für vom Volk selbst gemachten sozialen Bewegung suggests the divergence between the Hegelian Wissenschaft and the French and English, quote, science. This can be overstated, but the terms illuminate and ultimately sustain two conflicting Marxist approaches to history and society. The distinction between Wissenschaft and, quote, science gains currency only outside of the natural and exact sciences. This already structures the problem. The issue is how to transfer the methods of the natural sciences to the social, political, and philosophical terrain. The palpable advances of the natural sciences rendered this a compelling project. In duplicating the methods of the natural sciences, the hope was to duplicate its achievements. The project inspired myriad thinkers, from Auguste Comte to Émile Durkheim, Karl Popper, and contemporary social scientists, and it forms the nub and hub of positivist, non-Hegelian science. The history of these efforts is neither simple nor monotonous, and it is cluttered with reservations and qualifications. Footnote, the term, quote, positivism possesses many problems. Some restrict positivism to Comte and his direct followers. See the book by W.M. Simon, European Positivism in the 19th Century, published in 1963. Yet the Vienna Circle, with few or no links to Comte, adopted the term, quote, logical positivism. See A.J. Ayer's introduction to the book Logical Positivism, edited by A.J. Ayer in 1959. And in the same volume, see Moritz Schlick's article, Positivism and Realism. See Gustav Bergmann's book, The Metaphysics of Logical Positivism, published in 1967. Others, such as Karl Popper, who might be situated within the history of positivism, reject the term. See Popper's article, Reason or Revolution, published in the book, edited by T.W. Adorno et al., The Positivist Dispute in German Sociology, translated by Glyn Addy and David Frisby. Yet what Popper himself presents as the substance of his argument with the Vienna Circle suffices to include him Yet what Popper himself presents as the substance of his agreement with the Vienna Circle suffices to include him within the currents of positivism. Quote, I still feel very much at one with the Vienna Circle, end quote. And Popper mentions in particular the distinction Carnap drew between, quote, the way in which mathematicians and scientists proceed, end quote, and the, quote, depressing ways of the philosopher, end quote. Popper. This confirms Albrecht Velmer. Quote, Popper's criterion features the tendency proper to the positivist theory of science, that is, the intention to make scientific empiricism the unique, consciously applied law of scientific research. End quote. Albrecht Velmer, in the book Critical Theory of Society, 1971. In general, I follow Leszek Kolakowski's definition, quote, positivism is a collection of prohibitions concerning human knowledge intended to confine the name of, quote, knowledge or, quote, science to those operations that are observable in the evolution of the modern sciences of man, end quote. Leszek Kolakowski in the book The Alienation of Reason, A History of Positivist Thought, published in 1961, at least in English. Compare this with, quote, one of the tenets of positivism is methodological monism, or the idea of the unity of scientific method. A second tenet is the view that the exact natural sciences, in particular mathematical physics, set a methodological ideal or standard which measures the degree of development and perfection of all other sciences, including the humanities, end quote. George Henrik von Wright, Explanation and Understanding. The discussion in D.G. Charlton's book, Positivist Thought in France During the Second Empire, 1852 to 1870, published in 1959. End footnote. Each thinker selected and prized only some of the features of the natural sciences: quantification, natural laws, objectivity, clarity, and so on. Kant is illustrative. He originally considered sociology a, quote, special kind of physics, end quote. By name and substance, Kant patterned social physics on the natural sciences. He regarded, quote, all phenomena as subjected to invariable natural laws. Our business is, to pursue an accurate discovery of these laws with a view to reducing them to the smallest possible number, The best illustration of this is in the case of the doctrine of gravitation, end quote. Comte. Footnote. See Gertrude Lenzer's edited volume, Comte and Positivism, published in 1975. Und Comte see Otwin Massing's article or book, Fortschritt und Gegenrevolution, die Gesellschaftslehre Comtes in ihrer sozialen Funktion. And Oscar Neck's book, Strukturbeziehungen zwischen den Gesellschaftslehren Comte and Hegel. End footnote. In one fashion or another, positivists, quote, science imitated and adopted the procedures of the natural sciences. For example, the program of the Vienna Circle sought to replicate the progress of the natural sciences. The, quote, scientific world conception, end quote, the program explained, was, quote, empiricist and positivist, end quote, and applied, quote, logical analysis, end quote. These features called forth others. A scientific world conception necessitated the, quote, search for a neutral system of formulae, for a symbolism freed from the slag of historical languages. Neatness and clarity are striven for, and dark distances and unfathomable depths rejected, end quote. Footnote. Hans Hahn, Atte Neurath, and Rudolf Carnap in the article The Scientific Conception of the World, the Vienna Circle, published in 1929, republished in Atte Neurath's book Empiricism and Sociology, published in English in 1973. End footnote. The, quote, slag of historical languages, end quote, is the heap that separates the positivist science from Hegelian Wissenschaft. In the Hegelian tradition, the slag of history is as valuable as the nuggets. History is not footnoted or discarded, rather history infuses the theory. This is where Hegelian and positivist science separate. The natural world and its sciences knows history only externally. History does not determine structure or method. The difference between the study of the moon and the French Revolution is history. Inquiries of human behavior inspired by the study of the moon or the atom suppress or belittle the historical dimension. Quote, history does not mean here a chronicle of events, but the story of humanity as actor and victim. As Hegel's greatest student wrote, quote, men make their own history, end quote, adding the crucial qualification, quote, but they do not make it as they please, end quote. Marx, 18th Brumaire of Louis Bonaparte. Positivist science tends to eliminate history as so much slag or intellectual baggage. To be sure, the natural world and the natural sciences are hardly impervious to history. The problems and approaches are themselves a product of history. But finally, the structure of the moon or the atom is not historical. Quote, human history, wrote Marx citing Vico, quote, differs from natural history in that we have made the former but not the latter, end quote. Marx, Capital. The Hegelian Wissenschaft is not wider or larger than the positivist science. Rather, it is impregnated with history. The natural reality and natural sciences do not know the fundamental historical categories, consciousness and self-consciousness, subjectivity and objectivity, appearance and essence. In direct opposition to Hegelian logic, Otto Neurath, with Hans Hahn and Rudolf Carnap, wrote for the Vienna Circle, quote, in science there is no, quote, depths, there is surface everywhere, end quote. Or, quote, a scientific description can contain only the structure, of objects, not their, quote, essence. Subjectively experienced qualities, redness, pleasure, are as such only experiences, not knowledge, end quote. Neurath, Hans Hahn, and Carnap. Yet Hegelian thought must not be confused with mysticism or irrationality. It does not promote the cult of depths and essences. Positive and empirical sciences are not false, but limited. Quote, to such questions as when Caesar was born or how many feet there were in a stadium, etc., a neat answer should be given, just as it is surely true that the square of the hypotenuse equals the squares of the other two sides of a right-angled triangle. But the nature of such so-called truth is different from the nature of philosophical truths. End quote. Walter Kaufmann. Kaufmann's edited volume, Hegel, Text and Commentary. End footnote. The logic of the empirical sciences and common sense is not so much true or untrue as correct or incorrect. It does not attain truth. The judgment, quote, the rose, quote, is red, or, quote, is not red, and quote, unquote, can only be, quote, correct within the, quote, limited circle of perception, end quote. W. Wallace, Hegel. Hegel. Or, I don't know, the footnote says, what's the footnote say? The footnote says W. Wallace, translation of the logic of Hegel. W. Wallace, I don't know. Anyway, to Hegel, the ideal of the positive sciences, mathematics, is vulnerable to the same criticism. As a single mode of cognition, it is, quote, external and indifferent, end quote, as well as limited. Quote, our knowledge would be in very awkward predicament if such objects as freedom, law, morality, or even God himself, because they cannot be measured and calculated or expressed in a mathematical formula, were to be reckoned beyond the reach of exact knowledge, end quote. Hegel. Or I'm not sure if that actually is Hegel or if that's like an editor. As object and method, Hegel's Wissenschaft is saturated with history. This finally constitutes Hegel's protest against the positive and empirical sciences. They are historically blind and treat truth as formal and static. Quote, truth is not a minted coin which can be given and pocketed ready-made, end quote. Hegel. Again, I don't know if that's Hegel or not. I'm just going to stop saying who the quotes are because I can't really definitively say. History as a means and an end. Quote, the harmoniousness of childhood is a gift from the hand of nature. The second harmony must spring from the labor and culture of the spirit, end quote, from the historical process. These teachings of Hegel were neither well received nor well preserved. The story of the impact of Hegelian thought takes volumes. It is germane here in regard to a single issue. The critique of positivist science that does not collapse into irrationality or existentialism is unthinkable without Hegelian thought. This is why the reception of Hegel by Marxists is fundamental. As the following chapter seeks to demonstrate, this reception preceded and defined the texture of Marxism. Hegel remains an outsider to the major philosophical traditions. For instance, Anglo-American courses in the history of philosophy typically end with Kant and recommence in the 20th century with Ludwig Wittgenstein, Bertrand Russell, and the Vienna Circle. The 19th century with the troubling Hegel, as well as Marx, Kierkegaard, Nietzsche, and Schopenhauer, is regularly omitted or palmed off to the literature departments or to teachers not yet hired or about to be fired. Karl Popper's evaluation, if not representative, at least suggests the deep and general mistrust. In the book, The Open Society, a book that Popper tells us is grounded in a, quote, rational attitude, end quote, of, quote, openness of criticism, end quote, Popper introduces as, quote, excellent, the following judgment of Hegel. Quote, Hegel, was a flat-headed, insipid, nauseating, illiterate charlatan who reached the pinnacle of audacity in scribbling together and dishing up the crassest, mystifying nonsense. This nonsense has been noisily proclaimed as immortal wisdom by mercenary followers and readily accepted as such by all fools, end quote. And this quotation is from Karl Popper's Open Society, Its Enemies, Volume 2, and the quotation is from Schopenhauer. If Hegel fared better in the Marxist tradition, it was perhaps because he attracted little interest. He was easily situated, interpreted, and forgotten with the aid of some phrases by Marx or especially some texts by Engels. There's some quote, I can't even remember where it was from now, who said it. It was something like first generation, or like the first generation of like Marxism, so like Kautsky, Bernstein, pre-revisionism, and so forth. All the people that were associated with German social democracy didn't engage with Hegel because Engels did their engaging for them. I can't remember precisely where I got that from. Maybe it's C.A. Jordan. I don't know. Hegel was honored as the originator of idealistic dialectics, which with juggling could be rendered materialistic and scientific. They were ultimately codified by Stalin into a set of laws. Footnote, see Stalin's book Dialectical and Historical Materialism. What Lenin scribbled down during the enforced leisure of World War I, when Lenin began to study Hegel, remained an isolated statement. Quote, it is impossible completely to understand Marx's Capital, without having thoroughly studied and understood the whole of Hegel's logic. Consequently, none of the Marxists have understood Marx, and quote, Lenin. Footnote, see Lenin's conspectus of Hegel's book, The Science of Logic. And see the discussion in Raya Dunayevskaya's book, Philosophy and Revolution. And footnote. Yet Hegel's role or lack of a role should not be exaggerated. Neither the presence or absence nor the accurate or inaccurate interpretation of a single thinker can be held accountable for the vagaries of political and social movements. In this sense, the relation of Hegel to Marxism or Darwin to social Darwinism is not cause and effect. The founders succumbed to the imperatives of their followers. That Hegel has been consistently misread or unread suggests something important about the fabric of orthodox Marxism. Hegel proved a threat to the dominant idea of science. Consequently, orthodox Marxism has taught either to reduce Hegel to a positivist notion of science or to purge Hegel from Marxism. This has remained a current project of orthodox Marxism. In recent years, Althusser assumed this task. He is a short course on, quote, what is orthodox Marxism, end quote. Althusser's work has been marked by two closely related elements, a phobia of Hegel and a passion for science. Quote, we have the right, and the duty, politically, to use and defend, by fighting for the word, the philosophical category of, quote, science. To use and defend the word, quote, science, is a necessity in order to resist the bourgeois subjective idealist and the petty bourgeois Marxists, end quote. Althusser. And I think that's in Essays and Self-Criticism. It just says essays, but I think that's what the book is that's being referred to here. The main weapon of the petty bourgeois hordes is history, or, quote, historicism, in Althusser's lexicon. History and historicism compromise the rigor of science. Marxism is no more historical than language, quote, which is, as Stalin showed, escapes it, bracket, history, and bracket, end quote, Althusser. Footnote, see generally the piece, Marxism is not a historicism, in Althusser and Balibar's Reading Capital, which is on this channel. Next to history, the main danger to science is Hegel. Althusser has met this danger through exorcism. He argued that the, quote, young Marx was never strictly speaking a Hegelian, end quote, except in 1844 when he broke with Hegel. Althusser learned that this was never strictly speaking true except when he said it in 1965. Later he discovered Hegel everywhere and recast his thesis to save it. Marx was engaged in a lifelong flight from Hegel, and he attained safety only in death. With Althusser, anything short of rigor mortis lacks rigor. Although living Marx was tainted with Hegel, quote, the famous preface of 1859 is still profoundly Hegelian evolutionist, end quote. Althusser. In the preface to Capital, published in Lenin and Philosophy. Althusser's Geiger counter picks up Hegelian radiation even in Marx's Capital. It's 1% of Hegelian radioactivity is, quote, flagrant and extremely harmful, end quote. Althusser. Footnote, quote, a Hegelian evolutionist conception, disappears 99% in Capital, end quote. Althusser, in Preface to Capital, in the book Lenin and Philosophy. Only Marx's notes on Wagner, written the year before his death, are, quote, totally and definitively exempt from any trace of Hegelian influence. Only Marx's notes on Wagner, written in the year before his death, are, quote, totally and definitely exempt from any trace of Hegelian influence, end quote. Althusser. Preface to Capital. The generations of Marxists have been seduced by a popular idea of science cannot simply be traced to intellectual confusion. It is rooted rather in the ambivalent relationship between Marxism and bourgeois society. If Marx was capitalism's great critic, he was also its greatest admirer. If Marx's own position can be presented theoretically with some precision, but more or less theoretically it is presented individual Marxists of specific societies with endless difficulties. Capitalism was denounced for its exploitation, its brutality, pollution, hypocrisy, the list goes on. Yet it was welcomed, even celebrated, because it represented a giant step out of a pre-bourgeois order. Socialism could only be established on the foundation and wealth that capitalism produced. Capitalism was not only indispensable, it was desirable. The message for individual Marxists was more complex, especially for those located in societies where the work of capitalism was incomplete. This included all Marxists, with the possible exception of the English. In all other countries, capitalism remained a progressive force, and the working class was to abet capitalism until the material foundations for socialism had been created. The lesson was difficult and unpalatable. In January 1849, Marx advised the German Democrats and workers, quote, "We are certainly the last people to desire the rule of the bourgeoisie," end quote. Yet, quote, "It is better to suffer in modern bourgeois society, which by its industry creates the material means for the foundation of a new society that will liberate you all, than to revert to a bygone form of society which, thrust the entire nation back into medieval barbarism," end quote. Marx. Footnote. See Marx, Montesquieu, LVI. I guess that's some kind of Roman numeral that don't know. In the Neue Rheinische Zeitung, January 21st, 1849. End footnote. This says it exactly, perhaps too exactly, for this provoked responses from a, quote, ultra-left impatient with its evolutionary logic. Although these objections are generally ignored or slighted in the official histories, they touch a raw nerve of Marxism. In the aftermath of 1848, when these objections were raised, Marx advocated incremental social transformation. Protests emerged from various quarters and finally split the Communist League to which Marx and Engels belonged. Footnote. For a critique of Soviet accounts, see Boris Nikolovsky's article, Towards a History of the Communist League, 1847 to 1852. I think Boris Nikolovsky might have been a Menshevik emigre. I'm not sure. And footnote. Footnote. Marx's actions and politics in regard to the Cologne working class movement and the Communist League have been subject to much controversy. Part of the dispute concerns the authenticity of a deposition made by Peter Reuser, president of the Cologne Association of Workers. He reported, quote, "Both Marx and Schaper are opponents or even enemies as soon as it comes to the methods by which communism is to be obtained. The supporters of Schaper and Willich want communism introduced at the present stage of development, if necessary by force of arms. To Marx, communism is possible only as a result of an advance in education and general development. In one of his letters he addressed to us, he distinguishes 4 phases through which it will be necessary to pass before it is achieved," end quote. Boris Nikolovsky. And, that quote is from Peter Reuser, president of the Cologne Association of Workers. And that's published in Nikolovsky and Otto Männchen-Helfen's book, Karl Marx, published in 1976. The full text of Reuser and further discussion can be found in Werner Blumenberg's article Zur Geschichte des Bundes der Kommunisten, die Aussagen des Peter Gerhard Reuser, and Fritz Bruegel's article Zur Geschichte des Kölner Arbeitervereins, published in Die Gesellschaft 7, 1930. That this was Marx's position, if not his words, is confirmed by the minutes of the meeting of the League in 1850. In an off-cited passage, Marx attacks Willich and Schaper. Quote, "While we say to the worker, you must pass through 15, 20, 50 years of civil war in order to change the relations, in order to make yourself capable of power, you say instead, we must immediately come to power or we can stay asleep," end quote. Marx. And that's from the Sitzung der Zentralbehörde from 15 September 1850. In Marx Engels Werke. See Nikolovsky and Männchen-Helfen, Karl Marx. On Willich, see Lloyd D. Easton's book, Hegel's First American Followers. End footnote. Andreas Gottschalk asked Marx, sarcastically, quote, "Why should we make a revolution? Why would we, men of the proletariat, spill our blood? Should we really escape the hell of the Middle Ages by precipitating ourselves in the purgatory of decrepit capitalist rule? Are you not serious about the liberation of the oppressed?" End quote. Andreas Gottschalk. The charge was not fair, yet it located a tension in Marxism that regularly degenerated into a simple affirmation. Where capitalism was incomplete, Marxists were required to finish its work. The evil of retrograde social development was met by blessing capitalist development, which would finally issue into a new social order. This evolutionary logic was more than logic. It brought in its train attitudes and beliefs that corroded the theoretical and psychological impulse to subvert capitalism. The evaluation of colonialism by Marx displayed these same features. Brutal robbery and exploitation marked colonialism. Insofar as the material foundations of capitalism were established, however, colonialism progressed willy-nilly towards socialism. This, in brief, constituted Marx's appraisal of the English colonization of India. Quote, "The devastating effects of English industry, when contemplated with regard to India, are palpable and confounding." Unquote. But England has a, quote, "double mission in India, destroying the old society, quote, and the laying of the material foundations of Western society in Asia," end quote. Marx, quote, "Modern industry will dissolve the hereditary divisions of labor upon which rest the Indian caste, whose decisive impediments to Indian progress, Indian power," end quote. Marx. Footnote. See David McClelland's Karl Marx, published in 1977, Edmund Zillberner, Moses Hess, Geschichte seines Lebens, 1966, P.H. Noyes book, Organization and Revolution, Working Class Associations in the German Revolution of 1848-49, published in 1966. The quote "we" in the quotation is misleading. Gottschalk was a doctor. For a careful reconstruction of the events and issues, see Hal Draper's book, Karl Marx's Theory of Revolution, Volume 2, Politics and Social Class. End footnote. The charge... Where the hell am I? From the book, The Communist Manifesto, to the book Capital, the same dialectical vision informed Marx's analysis of modern society. Marx never doubted that the drive for profits constantly impelled the bourgeoisie to revolutionize the instruments of production. Quote, "Modern industry never views or treats the existing form of production process as the definitive one. Its technical basis is therefore revolutionary, whereas all earlier modes of production were essentially conservative." End quote. Yet the social relations in which the, quote, "technical basis of production was enmeshed constituted the devastating, quote, "negative side," end quote. Marx. Capital. If the terms are clear enough, the substance is not. That it has taken countless scholars to determine exactly what Marx was saying only suggests the difficulty of Marxists faced with political options and choices. The history of Marxism is the history of the loss of the dialectical critique of bourgeois society. The irresistible temptation was to cast the dialectical movement of society into a one-way and upward path. Progress in capitalism was read as progress towards socialism. The text of Marx could always be interpreted in this light. Marxists were confident that their quote, "science" was grounded in the actual movement of society. This distinguished Marxism from other and utopian socialisms which fled into the past or into rural enclaves. For the Marxists, however, the critique of capitalism was corroded by the endorsement of its achievements. Every chapter in the history of Marxism has been rent by this dialectic or inconsistency. The denunciation of capitalism vied with its affirmation. The beginnings of Russian Marxism conformed to this pattern. Appealing to economic or cultural realities, the populace argued that Russia would or should escape the disaster and evil of capitalist development. The Marxists retorted that capitalism was and should be developing Russia. This laid the foundation for a proletariat and finally a socialist revolution. For these reasons, capitalism could be evaluated as progressive. Lenin's book, Development of Capitalism in Russia, published in 1900, pursued this in detail. Inasmuch as the Russian Marxists strained to demonstrate the factual and positive impact of capitalism, they were tempted to minimize its destructiveness. If, quote, more, capitalism was preferable to, quote, less, was the critique of capitalism itself vitiated. Lenin directly addressed this question, quote, recognition of the progressiveness of this role, bracket, of capitalism, end bracket, is quite compatible, with the full recognition of the negative and dark sides of capitalism, end quote. Lenin. And that's from the Development of Capitalism in Russia. Yet for many Russian Marxists, this recognition proved difficult to maintain in practice. They extolled capitalism as enthusiastically that they forgot about socialism or tired of it. They no longer grasped how or where socialism differed from capitalism. This set the stage for a return to religion. The, quote, legal Marxists were especially prey to these options. Serge Bulgakov exalted as a Marxist that, quote, every new factory, every new industrial enterprise carries us forward, end quote. And he ended as a priest decrying the, quote, mechanical necessity, end quote, of Marxism. Struve, a legal Marxist, closed his major study with the words, quote, let us confess our cultural backwardness and let us go and learn from capitalism, end quote, and ended as a liberal. Footnote. Bulgakov is cited in Arthur P. Mendel's book, Dilemmas of Progress in Tsarist Russia, Legal Marxism and Legal Populism, published in 1961. And footnote. Footnote. The quote from Struve is cited in Shmuel Galai in the book The Liberation Movement in Russia, 1900 to 1905, published in 1973. See Richard Kindersley's book, The First Russian Revisionist, A Study of Legal Marxism in Russia, published in 1962. See Richard Pipe's Struve, Liberal on the Left, 1870 to 1905, and his introduction to P. von Struve's article, Les théories marxiennes de l'évolution sociale, published in Études de Marxologie, 1962. Bastian Wielenga, in the book Lenin's Weg zur Revolution, eine Konfrontation mit Sergei Bulgakov und Peter Struve im Interesse einer theologischen Besinnung, published in 1971, and Solomon M. Schwartz's article, Populism in Early Russian Marxism or Ways of Economic Development of Russia, end quote, published in the book Continuity and Change in Russia and Russian and Soviet Thought, edited by E.J. Simmons in 1955, and Andrei Bolitsky's book The Controversy Over Capitalism, published in 1969. And footnote. The same ambiguity corroded the Marxist opposition to colonialism. The Second International condemned colonialism as a violent appendage of capitalism. To some Marxists, however, it served a necessary and positive function in propelling the colonized along the path of industrialization. As one exponent of a, quote, positive colonial policy phrased it, quote, the primitive people will reach civilization only by bearing this cross, bracket, of capitalism, end bracket. It is therefore our duty not to hinder the development of capitalism, an indispensable chain in the history of humanity. We can even favor its appearance, end quote. Footnote. The text is included in Helene Carrière Denkaus and S.R. Schramm's book, edited volume Marxism in Asia, published in 1969. Georges Haupt and M. Weberu, edited volume DEM International, la DEM, I don't know if I'm saying that right, Internationale et Loyen, posted in 1967. For a summary of the debate on colonialism at Stuttgart in 1907, see Julius Braunthals' book, History of the International, Volume 1, 1864 to 1914. For a good discussion of the issue, see Horace B. Davis's book, Nationalism and Socialism, published in 1973. Davis attacks Abram Ascher's article, Imperialists Within German Social Democracy, prior to 1914, published in the Journal of Central European Affairs in 1961. See Max Victor's article, Die Stellung der deutschen Sozialdemokratie zu den Fragen der Auswärtigen Politik, 1869 to 1914. End footnote. The evaluation of technology by Marxists succumbed to the same pressures. A dialectical critique was sloughed off. Marxists did not doubt that technology constituted the greatest achievement of capitalism, distinguishing it from all previous societies. The suffering or misfortune resulting from technology was caused by the social context, not the apparatus itself. Such logic stuffed technology into familiar categories of means and ends. Technology was at best and worst a neutral endeavor. The evil resided only in the ends to which it was used. This approach infused orthodox Marxism. It cannot be accused of distorting Marx. Marx had always been a sharp critic of utopian, feudal, and romantic socialism. Each is oblivious or antagonistic toward the technological advances of capitalist industrialization. Little seemed more certain than Marxists accepted and even accelerated these advances. Nevertheless, a yawning gap between the general principles and the particulars vitiated a critical appropriation of a technological world. Technology everywhere was welcomed as facilitating socialism, and for that reason was exempt from critical inspection. Check out the book I have on here, edited by Phil Slater, on the critique of technology, which kind of tries to, which essentially agrees with Jacoby's point here. That's on this channel. Phil Slater. Marx is, of course, completely cognizant of the destructiveness of the labor process. On occasion, however, he had suggested that the division of labor within the factory were, quote, planned and regulated, whereas those in larger society were unregulated and anarchistic. The notion was attractive and popular because it inferred that the factory and technology are the progressive elements of capitalism. Irrationality was confined to the marketplace and found its boundary at the factory gate. Furthermore, the notion accorded with common sense, which could have confirmed the confusion and lawlessness of the market, but was mute before the apparent rationality and efficiency of production itself. Yet such a perspective capitulated to the mystique of technology. It reduced revolution to sacking the bosses, while protecting as sacrosanct the technological base. Footnote. Recent attempts have been made to retrieve Marx's critique of technology and division of labor. See Harry Braverman's book, Labor and Monopoly Capital, published in 1974, and my review, which elaborates some of the remarks in these pages, published in Telos 29, fall 1976. See also David F. Noble's book, America by Design, Science, Technology, and the Rise of Corporate Capitalism, published in 1977. Herbert Marcuse has made a celebrated interpretation of technology specific to capitalism. See William Leis's article, Technological Rationality, Marcuse and His Critics, in the book The Domination of Nature, published in 1972. End footnote. Lenin's evaluation of technology and of Taylorism in particular participate in this logic. The weakness of capitalist technology and Taylorism lay in their confinement to the factory. Quote, capital organizes and rationalizes labor within the factory. ... In social production as a whole, however, chaos continues to reign and grow, end quote. Lenin recognized that the Taylor system, quote, like all capitalist progress, is a combination of the refined brutality of capitalist exploitation and a number of the greatest scientific achievements, end quote. Lenin. Footnote. See Lenin's article, The Taylor System, Man's Enslavement by the Machine, in the collected works. The lesson was clear, quote, the Soviet Republic must at all costs adopt all that is valuable in the achievements of science and technology in this field. The possibility of building socialism depends exactly upon our success in combining the Soviet power and the Soviet organization of administration with the up-to-date achievements of capitalism. We must organize in Russia the study and teaching of the Taylor system and systematically try it out and adapt it to our own ends, end quote. Lenin. That's from The Immediate Tasks of the Soviet Government. Footnote. See Ulysses Santa Maria and Alain Manville's article, Lenin and the Problem of Transition, published in 1976. See Rainer Traub's article, Lenin and Taylor, published in 1978. That's on this channel. See Kendall E. Bale's article, Alexei Gostev and the Soviet Controversy over Taylorism, 1918-24, published in Soviet Studies, 1977. And F.J. and L.J. Flairon's article, Administrative Theory as Repressive Political Theory, The Communist Experience, published in 1972, and F.J. Flairon's edited volume, Technology and Communist Culture, published in 1977. End footnote. Stalin later defined Leninism as a combination of, quote, Russian revolutionary sweet with American efficiency, end quote. Footnote. See Stalin's article, The Foundations of Leninism, available in The Essential Stalin, edited by B. Franklin. According to Robert Tucker, Bukharin originated this formulation. See R. Tucker's book, Stalin is Revolutionary, 1879 to 1929. End footnote. The uncritical enthusiasm for technology was not grounded simply in the textual complexities of Marx. Nor was the plan to adopt and accelerate capitalist industrialization based simply on a misreading of Marx. Rather, such an argument ascribes too much importance to the text. Rather, the socio-economic imperatives of backwardness suppress the dialectical critique of technology. This resounds throughout Lenin's writings. Where are you headed?
Maybe get my toenails done.
Hell yeah. Have fun.
Polished them myself, but the two of them are starting to ingrow and the one split, and they can fix all that. So.
I'm sure the internet's gonna really like that.
What?
Hearing you talk about your toes.
Oh, sorry.
That's funny. Rather, the socioeconomic imperatives of backwardness suppress the dialectical critique of technology. This resounds throughout Lenin's writings. The work of capitalism was palpably incomplete, and if it was obvious to the Russians, then Marxists in Italy, France, and Germany were just as convinced. Footnote. For the wider impact of Taylorism, see Charles S. Mayer's book, Between Taylorism and Technocracy, European Ideologies and the Vision of Industrial Productivity, published in Journal of Continental History. I suppose this is J. Cont H. I'm not sure. See also Paul Devinat's book, Scientific Management in Europe, published in 1927. End footnote. If today large regions within the industrially advanced societies are, quote, underdeveloped, this is evidently more striking of a century ago. Of course, what constituted, quote, underdeveloped or, quote, overdeveloped is the essence of the matter. Footnote. Some years ago, Andre Gunderfrank sparked a debate re-examining the terms and realities of development and underdevelopment. See especially the article, The Development of Underdevelopment and Sociology of Development, in his book, Latin America, Underdevelopment or Revolution, published in 1969. Later contributions include Emanuel Wallerstein's edited volume, World Inequality, published in 1975, and Origi Emanuel's book, Unequal Exchange, published in 1972, and Samir Amin's Accumulation on a World Scale, 2 volumes, 1974. End footnote. Marx studied England because he was convinced that other West European countries would replicate its history. Quote, "The country that is more developed industrially only shows to the less developed the image of its own future." End quote. Germany, in comparison, suffered, quote, "not only from the development of capitalist production, but also from the incompleteness of that development." End quote. Marx. Capital. The, quote, "incompleteness of economic development as far as as factor conviction, encouraged the acceptance of evolutionary theories. For the first generation of Marxists after Marx, capitalism proved its ability to not only limp along, but to develop and expand. The last part of the century witnessed both the perfecting of new industrial technology, cheap steel, electric power, and the transformation of consumption, sewing machines, cheap clocks, bicycles, electric lighting. That these were not equally distributed is not to the point. They never had been. They suggested, however, that capitalism had hardly ceased to progress. The evolutionary progress of capitalism called forth and ratified the evolutionary and scientific doctrines of Marxists. Footnote. For a survey, see David S. Landis's book, The Unbound Prometheus, Technological Change and Industrial Development in Western Europe from 1750 to the Present, published in 1972. End footnote. These were not equally where am I? The critique of bourgeois society, Marxism, progressively lost its bite. The distance between Marxism and bourgeois society narrowed. Marxists and their opponents shared the belief in science, progress, and success. Revolution was not simply adjourned. Rather, the Marxists embraced the scientific and industrial rationality as their own. They saw themselves accelerating the advances of capitalism. The phenomenon of Marxists extolling and finally succumbing to capitalism did not go completely unnoticed. If the participants were blind, those in the outside or margins of Marxism were not. It is hardly fortuitous that the historian and sociologist of capitalist rationality, Max Weber, recognized the spirit of capitalism in the lair of the Marxists. Weber visited a party congress of the German Social Democrats, the SPD, in 1906 and concluded, quote, "These gentlemen no longer frighten anyone," end quote. Weber. The following year, Weber debated conservative sociologists on the threat of SPD electoral victory in several German cities. Quote, "I see no danger for bourgeois society in surrendering our cities to the SPD," end quote, said Weber. Weber noted that, quote, "no revolutionary enthusiasm," end quote, was expressed at the recent SPD Congress, and Weber anticipated that a victorious SPD would follow a, quote, "mercantile policy," end quote, encouraging the growth of capital. The profound complicity of orthodox Marxism in bourgeois industrialization is exposed by an absence. In the Marxist tradition, a searching critique of the, quote, "secondary characteristics of capitalism" is lacking. Secondary refers to those features that stand once removed from the primary economic organization of wages, working conditions, imperialism, and the market. It refers to a series of relations such as urbanism, mass media, psychological life, and leisure. These are not necessarily second in importance, but are second in that they cannot exist apart from the basic political economic organization of society. In recent decades, these areas have increasingly drawn the attention of Marxists, but earlier Marxists ignored them. The few analyses offered have been pedestrian and predictable. The secondary features have been disposed of by concepts taken from the basic dictionary of Marxism: superstructure, relations of production, accumulation, and so on. If none of these concepts have been wrong, none have grasped the specificity of the phenomenon. The usual explanation for the banality of Marxism refers to the ills of, quote, vulgar Marxism. Vulgar Marxism is vulgar in its economic reductionism. Everything lacks substance and reality beyond an economic base. This does not suffice as an explanation for the lameness of Marxism. Not only vulgar Marxism, but its vulgar critique needs to be surmounted. The vulgar critique of vulgar Marxism glosses over the complicity between the Marxists and the secondary features of capitalism. This was the reason for blindness. They have not perceived these features as fundamentally changing, hence there was no reason for scrutiny. The Marxists would inherit the cities and mass newspapers, only the signs and headlines would be changed. Rockefeller Plaza would become Leninplatz. The basic rapport with industrial life paralyzed the critique. This can be stated in the obverse more emphatically. The most compelling and illuminating analyses of the secondary processes derive from a conservative, sometimes reactionary tradition. This runs from Nietzsche and Spengler to contemporary and surely lesser critics, such as Jacques Ellul and Ivan Illich. This is hardly a coherent tradition, and it is radically flawed in more than one respect, yet the analyses that are proffered are unmatched and unassimilated by Marxists. For example, Spengler's analysis of the daily press of 1919 found no counterpart in the literature of the Marxists. Quote, English-American politics have created through the press, a force field of worldwide intellectual and financial tensions in which every individual unconsciously takes up the place allotted to him so that he must think, will, and act as a ruling personality. Somewhere or other in the distance thinks fit. Man does not speak to man. The press and its associate, the electrical news service, keep the waking consciousness of whole peoples and continents under a deafening drumfire of theses, catchwords, standpoints, scenes, feelings, day by day and year by year. The scattering sheets of the Age of Enlightenment transform themselves into the, quote, press, a term of most significant anonymity. Today, we live so cowed under the bombardment of this intellectual artillery that hardly anyone can attain the inward detachment that is required for a clear view of the monstrous drama. The liberal bourgeois mind is proud of the abolition of censorship, the last restraint, while the dictator of the press, Northcliffe, keeps the slave gang of his readers under the whip of his leading articles, telegrams, and pictures. Democracy has, by its newspapers, completely expelled the book from the mental life of the people. Democracy has, by its newspapers, completely expelled the book from the mental life of the people. The people read the one paper, its paper, which forces itself through the front doors by millions daily, spellbinds the intellectual from morning to night, drives the book into oblivion by its more engaging layout, and if one or another specimen of a book does emerge into visibility, forestalls and eliminates its possible effects by, quote, reviewing it. What the press wills is true. Its commanders evoke, transform, interchange truths. 3 weeks of press work and the truth is acknowledged by everybody. The reader neither knows nor is allowed to know the purpose for which he is used. A more appalling caricature of freedom of thought cannot be imagined. Formerly, a man did not dare to think freely. Now he dares but cannot imagine. Now he dares but cannot. Now he dares but cannot. End quote. Oswald Spengler. This assault on capitalism can be found in Nietzsche's analysis of morality and bad consciousness, or more recently in Illich's discussion of the medicalization of society. These conservative critics penetrate and grasp phenomena that the Marxists revere and pass over. The source of their insight are at hand, unlike the Marxists. They find capitalist rationality and progress grating. This allows and encourages insights barred to the Marxists who are less hostile to the beat of capitalism. The Marxists hear the squeaks and groans where the mechanism needs oil and new bearings. To these critics, the hum itself is offensive. To many of the conservatives, Marxism itself appeared as simply another industrialization scheme. Conventional liberalism and wisdom feared Marxism as a threat to capitalist industrialization. These critics feared the opposite. Marxism accelerating industrialization. Spengler considered Marxism a version of the English Industrial Revolution. It concentrated on business, profits, and classes. Marx was a, quote, exclusively English thinker, end quote, adopting the terms, ethics, and categories of the Industrial Revolution. Quote, he took his principles from the very thing he was fighting, end quote. Marx intended to extend capitalism to the working class, turning each worker into a merchant who would sell his labor at the highest price. In the light of the history of Marxism and trade unions, Spengler's judgment cannot be rejected as simply perverse. Quote, Marxism is the capitalism of the working class, end quote. Spengler. And that quote's from Prussianism and Socialism in the Selected Essays, edited by D.O. White. This position contrasting Prussian to English socialism was not unique to Spengler. It reached back to Fichte and forward to Zombart. See Zombart's book Deutscher Sozialismus, published in 1934, which juxtaposes German to proletarian socialism. The latter is the theory of Marxian industrialization. See Ernst Stutz's book Oswald Spengler als politischer Denker, published in 1958, which locates Spengler within a 20th century, quote, conservative revolution, end quote. For predecessors, see Hans J. Schoep's Vorläufer Spenglers, published in 1955, and see Anton M. Kochtanek, Oswald Spengler in seiner Zeit, published in 1968. And footnote. It is not coincidental that the few Marxists who swam against the tide of capitalist rationality did not sever all links to conservatism, romanticism, or utopianism. They remained detached to a non-capitalist logic. They include William Morris of the 19th century, Ernst Bloch, André Breton, and the Frankfurt School of the 20th century. Their intellectual sources enabled them to see through the mirror of the economy. They were alerted not simply to the falling rate of profit, but to the falling rate of intelligence and beauty. Footnote, see my article, Falling Rate of Intelligence, published in Telos in 1976. These figures are linked by their resistance to socialism as a souped-up version of capitalism. The unorthodox Marxists retrieved the substance of Marx. Socialism promised more than a rise in wages or an expansion of cities. A rise in wages, Marx wrote in Capital, quote, only means, in fact, that the length and weight of the golden chain the wage laborer has already forged for himself allows it to be loosened somewhat. End quote. Marx. Capital. Neither the elevation nor the equalization of wages was the goal of Marx's socialism. Marx early and late denounced, quote, barracks communism. Footnote, quote, we have tried on the one hand to refrain from all system making and all barracks room communism, end quote. And that's from a circular of the First Congress of the Communist League to the League members, June 9, 1847. Although Marx and Engels did not write this, it was probably written under Engels' supervision, and it referred to his draft of a communist confession of faith. See also Marx's denunciation of barracks communism in Ein Komplott gegen die IAA. I don't know how to say I think it's like A is ah in German. So, whatever I is. Anyway, liberation is more than electing the bosses, thereby trading subjugation for self-subjugation. Quote, criticism has plucked the imaginary flowers on the chain, not in order that man shall continue to bear that chain without fantasy or consolation, but so that he shall throw off the chain and pluck the living flower. End quote. Marx, Critique of Hegel's Philosophy of Right, Introduction. Where am I? The idioms diverge, but the basic thinking of the unorthodox Marxist is not. Morris cautioned again and again not to confuse, quote, the machinery of socialism, and quote, with socialism, to substitute a, quote, business-like administration in the interest of the public, end quote, for a laissez-faire and coercive regime that would be a great game but not the goal. Footnote. See the article by William Morris, Communism, in the book Prose, Verse, Lectures, and Essays, edited by G.D.H. Cole, 1948. And footnote. Socialism is not utilitarianism, it is leisure. Quote, the leisure which socialism above all things... the leisure which socialism above all... I don't know if there's a typo here. It says, quote, the leisure which socialism brings above all things aims at obtaining for the worker. It's also the very thing that breeds desire for beauty, for knowledge, for more abundant life, in short. End quote. William Morris. Published, that's from the article, The Worker's Share of Art, which is available in Selected Writings and Designs, edited by A. Briggs. Footnote. E.P. Thompson, in his 1976 postscript to the book William Morris, puts the issue well. Quote, the Romantic tradition is not to be defined only in terms of its traditional, conservative, quote, regressive, quote, escapist, and, quote, utopian characteristics, and hence to be seen as a continual undertow threatening to draw Morris back to, quote, subjectivism and, quote, idealism, end quote, end quote. Morris. See Michael Levin's article, Marx and Romanticism, published in Political Studies, 1974. And footnote. Bloch salvaged the utopian and romantic note in Marxism. The, quote, naked economic orientation, quote, paralyzed orthodox Marxists. The, quote, soul and, quote, belief to replace it were lacking. Footnote. See, Bloch... Where the hell am I? Okay, sorry. Bloch salvaged the utopian and romantic note in Marxism. Footnote. See David Gross's article, Marxism in Utopia, Ernst Bloch, published in the book Toward a New Marxism, edited by Grahl and Piccone, 1973. See Maynard Solomon's article, Marx and Bloch, published in Telos, 1972. See Oscar Neck's article, Ernst Bloch, the German Philosopher of the October Revolution, published in New German Critique, 1975. See Jürgen Habermas's article, Ernst Bloch, a Marxist Romantic, published in 1969 to 1970. See Douglas Kellner and Harry O'Hara's book, Utopia and Marxism in Ernst Bloch, published in New German Critique, and Helmut Reineke's Materie und Revolution, eine materialistische erkenntnistheoretische Untersuchung zur Philosophie, Ernst Bloch, 1974. And footnote. The, quote, naked economic orientation and, quote, paralyzed orthodox Marxism. See Bloch, Doch die Wüste, 1964. First edition, 1923. If the economy had been analytically subverted by the Marxists, quote, the soul and, quote, belief to replace it were lacking. See Bloch's Geist der Utopie, first edition, 1918. For Bloch, The Path from Utopia to Science, the title of Engels' popular pamphlet, skipped too much. It eliminated the driving force of the utopian vision. What Bloch called the, quote, warm current of Marxism must be retrieved, lest it be suffocated by the, quote, cold current of technocratic Marxism. Breton, like Bloch, refused to sever links to super-economic logic and terrains. Breton refused the either-or of orthodoxy, either industrialization or imagination. Quote, in the realm of facts as we see it, no ambiguity is possible. All of us seek to shift power from the hands of the bourgeoisie to those of the proletariat. Meanwhile, it is nonetheless necessary that the experiments of inner life continue. End quote. André Breton, in an article titled Legitimate Defense, published in 1926. And that's from Breton, What is Surrealism? Selected Writings, and edited by Franklin Rosemont. Quote, I really fail to see some narrow-minded revolutionaries, notwithstanding, why we should refrain from supporting the revolution, provided we view the problems of love, dreams, madness, art, and religion from the same angles as they do. End quote. André Breton, in the Second Manifesto of Surrealism, which is available in the book Manifestos of Surrealism. See generally Maurice Nadeau's book, The History of Surrealism. See, published in 1965. See Herbert Gershman's book, The Surrealist Revolution in France, published in 1968. See J.H. Matthews' book, Towards the Poetics of Surrealism. Robert S. Short provides the conventional interpretation of the incompatibility of surrealism and Marxism in the article The Politics of Surrealism 1920 to 1936, in the book Left-Wing Intellectuals Between the Wars 1919 to 1939, edited by W. Lecoeur and G.L. Mauss. And footnote. In the cant of orthodox Marxism, all of these figures are charged with the same infraction, violating the code of science. The code adumbrated various subsections, itemizing romantic, pessimistic, and subjective and utopian violations. For one guardian, the book History and Class Consciousness was, quote, the first major eruption of the romantic anti-scientific tradition of bourgeois thought into Marxist theory, end quote. Gareth Stedman Jones. Footnote. See Gareth Stedman Jones' article The Marxism of the Early Lukács, published in New Left Review, 1971. See Alvin Goldner's article The Two Marxisms, published in the book For Sociology. This is expanded into Goldner's final work, The Two Marxisms, which appeared too late for me to consider. In spirit and argument is frequently close to this book. And footnote. The charge against the Frankfurt School runs, quote, where am I? Shit. In the cant of orthodox Marxism, all these figures are charged with the same infraction, violating the code of science. The code adumbrated various subsections, itemizing romantic, pessimistic, and subjective violations. For one guardian, the book History and Class Consciousness was the, quote, first major eruption of the romantic anti-scientific tradition of bourgeois thought into Marxist theory, end quote. And that was Gareth Stedman Jones. The charge against the Frankfurt School runs, quote, in the place of revolutionary science enters bourgeois cultural pessimism, end quote. And that's from J. Henrik von Heiseler in the edited volume Die Frankfurter Schule im Lichte des Marxismus, 1970. And footnote. Adorno and Max Horkheimer are accused of, quote, spiritualism and Marcuse petty bourgeois anarchism, end quote, a crime that is extended, quote, to all those who have taken him seriously, end quote. Lucio Coletti, in the book From Rousseau to Lenin. Coletti himself is sometimes difficult to take seriously. Quote, the only way in which Marxism can be revived is if no more books like my book, Marxism and Hegel, are published, end quote. Lucio Coletti, and that's from an article, from an interview, a political and philosophical interview with Lucio Coletti, published in New Left Review, 1974. And footnote. Wilhelm Reich and his followers did not escape the police raid. Quote, your starting point is consumption, ours is production, therefore you are not Marxist, end quote. Footnote. Cited by Reich in his What is Class Consciousness? of 1934, which is available in Sexpol, Essays 1929 to 34, edited by L. Baxendal. For other criticisms by the communists, see the article Geschichte der deutschen Sexpol-Bewegung in the Zeitschrift für politische Psychologie und Sexualökonomie 2. See also Konstantin Sinelnikov's article Early Marxist Critiques of Reich, published in Telos 1972, and footnote. The surrealists were indicted for blocking capitalist development. Quote, it is necessary to affirm plainly that the movement that one could call technological, bracket, machiniste, bracket, is destined to develop in the world in an irresistible fashion. ... Communism should be one of the principal factors of its development, end quote. Pierre Neville, La Révolution et l'Intellectuel, 1927. Against the dirty words, romanticism, subjectivism, aestheticism, utopianism, the clear ones are invoked: science, objectivity, rigor, structure. Here the final and almost psychological contours of orthodox Marxism come into view. Adorno's characterization of positivism as, quote, the puritanism of knowledge, and quote, holds true for orthodox Marxism. Footnote. See Adorno, the positivist dispute in German sociology. The goal is rigorous self-control and self-discipline. The asceticism of orthodox Marxism despises unregulated insight as if it were the threat it actually is. The sexual code is internalized as conceptual commandments. Suggestions of utopia and romanticism are tabooed as too suggestive. Scientific Marxism dreams not of a life without anxiety, but of master plans and inter-office memos. That's so fucking funny. Scientific Marxism dreams not of a life without anxiety, but of a master plans and inter-office memos. Structural Marxism not only examines, but is in love with structures. It fears the unstructured. Asceticism is the conceptual center of gravity of orthodox Marxism. Concepts are multiplied to stamp out dissolute thought and thinkers. The object is to become an object, hence the hatred for the subjective. That the centers have been regularly derided as infantile implies the psychosexual core. Authority is threatened. Footnote. The charge of infantilism can be found in Engels' rebuke to the, quote, Jungen, unquote, opponents of German social democratic orthodoxy. See Engels' Antwort an die Redaktion der Sächsischen Arbeiterzeitung. See Dirk H. Müller's book Idealismus und Revolution zur Opposition der Jungen gegen den sozialdemokratischen Parteivorstand, and Hans M. Bach's book Geschichte des, quote, linken Radikalismus in Deutschland. Hans M. Bach is like one of the people whose name you see a lot in like things about like council communism and anarchism in Germany, syndicalism, so on and so forth. And footnote. One critic has offended that nowhere in the book History and Class Consciousness is Marxism recognized as a, quote, real and responsible science, unquote. See Jones, the Marxism of the early Lukács. Yeah, Gareth Stedman Jones, I think, was like one of the people who's like kind of in New Left Review circles, who was like in New Left Review, people like Perry Anderson and so forth, amongst others. I think were very big proponents of Althusser, and definitely kind of come from the intellectual world of like Isaac Deutscher, like the kind of like the more pro-Soviet wing of Trotskyism. generally speaking. The gun of science is cocked whenever thought thinks too much. Another critic growls that unless we, quote, move on from the discovery of the horrors of capitalism to an attempt to understand it scientifically, end quote, we will be plagued by, quote, another 40 years of paralyzed virtuosity, end quote, of the Frankfurt School. And that's from an article by Göran Terborn, The Frankfurt School, published in New Lecture Review, 1970. The threat of paralyzed virtuosity is met by preventive arrest and 5-year plans. The, quote, first concern, end quote, wrote Horkheimer about Orthodox Marxists, quote, when they think about freedom, is the new penal system, not its abolition, end quote. That's so good. And that's from Horkheimer, The Authoritarian State, originally from 1940. Along with Benjamin Franklin, Orthodox Marxism is infused with the spirit of Puritanism. The mental apparatus with permanent press concepts tames the chaos of desire. Orthodox Marxism confirms what Mary Douglas called the, quote, purity rule, end quote, an increase, quote, to disembody or etherealize the forms of expression, end quote, correspond to a tightening net of social domination. Footnote, see Mary Douglas's book Natural Symbols, published in 1973, and her book Purity and Danger, published in 1978. The dirty words of Marxism and humanism itself recall the corporal and carnal reality that gives the lie to pristine theories of metastructures. As a cohort of Althusser put it, quote, I shall not be satisfied until I either situate it, bracket, quote, the word man, end quote, in bracket, in the necessity of the theoretical system, or eliminated it as a foreign body, end quote. Balibar in Reading Capital. I would have missed this revealing passage without E.P. Thompson's discussion of it in his book, The Poverty of Theory. And footnote. The conformity of Orthodox Marxism serves the cold passion for science and authority. Althusser tells us that ideology belongs to the future as well as to the past. Althusser means keep your uniforms. The logic of, quote, so much the worse for the facts, and, quote, challenge the regulations that have domesticated Marxism. Nevertheless, the choices are not between facts and fantasy, conceptual rigor and free association. Ew. Science and poetry, or optimism and pessimism. These are the bad choices that perpetuated Marxism as caricature. The pieces do not fit neatly together, but neither does society. This suggests at least one guide for a critical Marxism. Do not lose the pieces. Do not lose the pieces. Okay, and that's the end of chapter 1 of Dialectic of Defeat by Russell Jacoby. Thank you so much for listening.